Hey everyone, welcome to the Funding Freedom Podcast. My name is Ben Stef. I'm your host, and as an investor-focused mortgage lender, my job is to not only get you a little bit closer to financial freedom, but also to understand the loan options available to you today as an investor. So with me on this podcast, I have Mike and Jake, who lead up the Axon Group here in Chicago, and they're basically the go-to brokers when it comes to multifamily properties. I think year to date right now, they're almost at 100 million in transactions closed as of like November 7th, the time of this recording. So they're doing something right. And with that being said, in this podcast, we're going to cover high-level tactics on how to buy multifamily properties, market updates, and huge mistakes that they see a lot of investors make that really can cost you thousands of dollars. And so if you're like looking to invest or you're just curious about the market, we have a lot of great insights lined up for you guys today. So Mike and Jake, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Really excited.
Yeah, no, I know this market is so dynamic and things are changing, so I'm excited to kind of dive in with you guys. But Mike, let's start off with first question I'll throw your way is, can you give us a brief overview of the current multifamily market in Chicago? And I'll let you touch on whatever data points you want to cover that might be important.
Sure. Yeah. And this, is kind of applicable for local investors. It's really applicable for out-of-state investors. Is kind of what we see versus, other markets. And here in Chicago versus a lot of major markets, we are a higher cap rate environment with steady growth. We're not a flat environment by any means. We're still seeing, I believe, it depends on the numbers that you look at, anywhere from about 4.5 to 6.8% appreciation year on year for the last couple of years. It's August to August based on the numbers that we're seeing. And so it's still a steady growth market, but we see much higher cap rates than areas like Los Angeles or New York, Miami, other major markets. So even in our A-class areas, as investors will call them, your Lincoln Park, your Lakeview, on newer construction stuff, we're seeing 5.5 to 6.25 cap rates. Our B and C class areas are anywhere from 7 to 8.5% cap rates, depending on the asset type. And then, it can go up from there depending on where you're wanting to invest. But that is very applicable for out-of-state investors who are seeing, 2 to 4% cap rates in a lot of their markets. And we still have the stability of a lot of major companies that stay here, a pretty steady population that, anchors the city down. So I think that it is a great investing environment, and I don't see that changing.
Aside from that, are there any other factors you think that contribute to why this market is steadily growing?
Yeah, I mean, the population is going to continue to grow no matter what. There's just going to be more and more people on Earth. You look at a population counter online, and it just continues to tick up. But there isn't a whole lot of room to build here in Chicago. They can grow outward, and we are seeing that, new developments as you get toward, the western suburbs, the north suburbs, southwest suburbs. There's a lot of development going on, but if people want to live close to the city, there's not a whole lot of extra room to build unless they tear down and build up. So as the population grows, there's going to be continued pressure on, rents, and there's going to be continued pressure on prices as well, just because there's going to be so many more people demanding to rent and to buy. So that is a factor in and of itself. We're just not, an area that is, ripe for, a lot of growth in terms of building. So it's going to be growth in prices and rents.
Right. That makes sense. If, the demand is going to, supply isn't catching up to the demand. So with that being said, we have to either just increase the prices, we have appreciation, or we have to build. But in this case, we can't even build. I think that's dead on. In your experience, Mike, have you seen over the last 5 to 7 years, has there been sort of an evolution of multifamily properties in our market? Any substantial changes that you've seen aside from prices and appreciation?
Yeah, there's a number of different things that I can say, and it just depends on how you want to look at it. There's a decreasing supply of a lot of these multifamily, because a lot of these people that have held these multifamily for 30, 40 years in a lot of the areas that have become popular, you're looking at your Belmont Cragen, your Logan Square area, Avondale, they've been held by families, and you see a lot of families that, you know, take up a 3-unit, and, you know, the parents live on one level and the, you know, kids live on another level and things like that, even as adults. A lot of those are being bought up by investors and turned into single family. So a lot of single family conversion. So that's actually decreased our supply from what we've classically had. But it's also become very popular. You know, podcasts like this, podcasts like Bigger Pockets are just encouraging these young investors and changes in the way that you can invest as well. You know, last year, all of a sudden they said, hey, it's not just FHA that you can put a low down payment on a, you know, a large multifamily. Now you can put 5% down up to the loan limits. And the loan limits in Chicago are huge. You can basically buy a 4-unit and, you know, put down 5% up to, you know, with the new loan limits, gosh, like 1.75 million.
1.4. Yeah, it was
So
like
1.496 was the old loan limit, and that's going up. And then you know, divide that by 0.95 and figure out, you know, what your max purchase price is with a 5% down payment. You know, if you're a 20-something-year-old investment banker and you have the money to do it, and you can buy a, you know, 1.7 million dollar 4-unit and live in it for, you know, less than you would be paying rent, why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah.
So it's become a super popular thing. Whereas, you know, 10, 15 years ago, the multifamily market was not as invested in. There wasn't this huge, you know, fire movement that's been going on for young professionals.
Yeah. And for those listening, when we talk about conforming limits in our financing in the mortgage world, when a loan amount is above, so not the price, but the loan amount is above a limit, basically that puts you in a different category of what we call jumbo, which means 20% down, higher rates, longer process. It's a completely different like animal and different world. So in Chicago, like what Mike was saying, we have an interesting opportunity where like I just got under contract for we were under contract for $1.4 million property in Logan Square. And my client couldn't believe it. He was like, you're telling me I could put 5% down on this 4-unit? That's like 1.45. And I'm like, yeah. And we locked him in when rates dipped recently. We locked him in at 6.125, and he couldn't believe it. He was like, this is stupid. And I'm like, yeah, like that's the world that we live in now. So because of the conventional changes last year in November, allowing people to put 5% down, that really opens up the door. So Mike, I think that's great insight. Pointing it to you though, Jake, what are some key trends that you're seeing in the multifamily like sector? Kind of like maybe even if you want to talk about predictions or projections, but what are some like insights in the multifamily like space that you think would be important to know?
Yeah, I mean, I'll piggyback off of the recent shift in the conventional financing minimums, right? That 5% is huge, because what that's done is it's changed a lot of our conversations with these house hack first-time buyers who are buying 2 to 4 units. Initially, it was very focused on what can we get for you that passes FHA standards, right? What meets the self-sufficiency test, which was a giant hurdle, right? Like, so we were really kind of limited to focusing only on duplexes up to $550,000 or triplexes up to around the same number, right? If you wanted to put under 5% down or 10% down, because they had to meet this stress test. So it's really changed the demand, in my opinion, for those 3 to 4 unit properties in Chicago above $600,000, say, right, for now. So we're seeing that kind of shift in mindset for young buyers, because before it was they could afford an $800,000 3-unit, call it. They just didn't have the cash to put down, right? So they could afford it on paper. They could get pre-approved for $800K, but they just were like, well, I don't have 12% or 15% because it just wasn't conforming or wasn't going to pass the self-sufficiency test for FHA. So that's a trend we're seeing, and I think that's boosting demand for those type of properties, right? So I don't think that's going to slow down. In fact, if and when rates come down, I think the demand for these expensive, I want to say expensive, but 1.3 to 1.5 for 3 to 4 unit buildings that can potentially, call it, break even at like 10% down post move out or at full gross rent. It's a no-brainer, right? It's a no-brainer for these buyers, where before it was a tougher sell. And it's still a little bit of a tougher sell if you're like, hey, it's not going to break even until 15% down, right? Or when you move out, when you move out in a few years, if and when you're going to be net negative $800 a month. That's not very comforting to young buyers. But as soon as that number gets really close to break even, if and when rates are lower, it's just going to really push demand. So we see that as a trend. And I would say what we've seen too in the last, 5 to 10 years with rent growth being really strong in Chicago, let's call it 5 years, is a lot of these build to rent 3 units, right? A lot of developers are putting up these 3-unit buildings for somewhere between $800 and $1.2 million in areas like West Pilsen, Bronzeville, Tri-Taylor, East Garfield Park, where before their only option was to go condos or really high-end condo conversions. And now the rents are so strong or strong enough where they can sell these to pure investors, right? Or house hackers or anyone that they don't need to split these into condos anymore. So I don't see that changing anytime soon, unless, again, demand becomes really, really strong in these areas for condos, because rent, in my opinion, is only going to go up. We don't see a lot of cranes in the air, right? Especially in these fringe neighborhoods, the far northwest side. They might develop a big 200-unit building in West Loop or something like that. But the new inventory in Logan Square, places like that, it's not happening, right? We saw this recent passing of the builders, the restrictions on just everything in Logan Square. I don't know if that's why your deal fell apart, but it's happening. So there's limited supply. I think that the demand, again, looking forward, the demand for those nice 3 to 4 units is going to be kind of crazy the next few years.
Especially with the 5% down program. When that opened up, it was like Armageddon, like everybody now, it's just the barrier of entry was a lot lower. Because I think a lot of people historically have looked to FHA 3.5 down, it's very attractive. But then that self-sufficiency test that I, told a lot of clients actually, which surprised me, a lot of lenders didn't even know about it until they got into underwriting and under contract. And then they're running the numbers, and now the deal falls through. Some clients had to fight for their earnest money because they found out, and the lender was too afraid to bring it up. So there's a lot of issues with FHA right now buying 3 to 4 unit properties because rates are up. And for those listening that don't know, every property that you buy FHA, 3 or 4 unit, has to basically be self-sufficient. FHA has this weird rule where the income of the property has to cover the mortgage payment. But the problem is FHA takes a huge cut for vacancies. And because of rates, those two things really kill over 90% of the deals. So unless you're buying down the rate a lot, unless you're putting a lot of money down, just preface that, guys, by knowing that right now it'd be pretty hard to buy FHA. But you mentioned, Jake, a lot of really interesting things. I think Logan Square and Humboldt Park are very fascinating neighborhoods, in my opinion, because 15, 20 years ago, guys, they were pretty bad. Nobody wanted to move there. Everybody was those were pretty bad neighborhoods, and now it's completely 180, right? All the young people that work downtown that make 6 figures, they want to live there. There's a lot of weird, and the multifamily, our deal that fell through, it's a lot of older folks that, let's say, don't want to take care of the building, or they don't really care. And so you're seeing a lot of older 3 or 4 unit properties, like you said, that they've held on to for 20, 30, 40 years.
A quick question for you. How much have you been loving these podcast episodes? I've been getting a lot of great feedback from you guys. And right here is where I typically put in an ad or something for these episodes. But you know what? I was thinking about it, and the only thing I really want to promote right now is for you to just hit that subscribe button. I'm trying to grow this thing out, and so many of you are watching, listening, and sharing, but you're not subscribed to the channel, so please hit the subscribe button, and that's really going to allow me to grow this thing and continue to provide value for you guys. Let's get back to the episode.
One question I have, Jake, for you before we move on back to Mike is, you mentioned because of rates and post moving out with breaking even and things like that, where do you think rates have to be for really for investors to feel a little bit more at ease at buying these multifamily properties?
So I wouldn't know exactly where the rates have to be to make this number hit, but I can tell you right now, I use a very rough rule of thumb. If a well-kept property in a decent neighborhood, call it a Humboldt or a Logan, it doesn't have to be A class, but maybe B plus, A minus. If it can break even at somewhere between 10 and 15% down with estimated gross rents, that's like my initial filter. Like that's a decent deal, let's call it. Like if it's not breaking even, hope there's got to be some upside, or it needs to maybe in a really nice area, right? Like a lower cap rate type area. So whatever gets that number down to somewhere between 5 and 10% interest rate wise, I think is a big threshold for people, right? So I use that 5 to 10% down, but it's more of like, I think younger people or people looking to house hack, let's call it, they can swallow that like $500 net negative per month, right? Something like that. But there seems to be a mental barrier above that. So that's, assuming a $800 to $1 million property, that's probably somewhere in the fives, right? The high fives, or the mid fives. We don't need to drop a whole percentage point, right? Like, but we need to get down like a full point, ish, I think, and then before things go really kind of nuts. But it really depends on the neighborhood. So it's hard to say exactly, but lower than current.
Yeah, right. And even if rates do go back into the fives for conventional, like I think, I don't know how long it's going to stay, to be honest, number one. And then number two, even with that being said, as we're looking at the 10-year treasuries and the spread and all that, even with that, like the 5% down program may not be here forever. So what might have happened is Fannie, who runs basically our mortgage world, might have released it to like help encourage, let's get some more mortgages in the door here. But then like if things pick up again, that program might not be available anymore. And we might only have the FHA program. So like before I ask Mike my next question, Jake, can you shed some insight on like if there's any investors right now, like let's say investment banker or someone who's a successful business person, like they have some money, they want to invest, they want a house hack, right? Maybe they can afford to do so, but they're not making a ton of cash flow off the first building. Can you shed some more light on like some key indicators or what to look for if they're a little bit hesitant to buy a 3 or 4 unit building?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be rent growth too, right? So we try to be pessimistic looking into the future too. So when I say breaking even or gross rent, we're kind of looking at the current rents, but the game changes completely if there's value add potential, right? So if you have some extra cash put to the side and you're a little bit more conservative, you're worried about that net number in the future, your net, your PITI minus your gross revenue, then here the answer is to raise rents. How can you raise rents? Well, you can raise them naturally over time, or you can force appreciation by doing updates, adding unit laundry, doing, essential air conditioning. These are things that like your broker can probably put some black and white numbers to, right? Hey, if you spend $25,000 on this unit, you'd be able to raise the rent $300 or $400 based on rental comps. So I think the analytical person, would make them feel a lot better about that, right? Versus, oh, well, let's just hope rents are up 10% in 3 years. Like maybe. So I would say look for that. That's something you can focus on. Those are questions you can ask your agent, like black and white questions, like, hey, I have some extra cash. For those people that might have some cash but are again just worried about that that net number, you don't need to put 25% down. Hold on to that cash, get as highly leveraged as you can, get into a property that's, can pass conventional financing, but just needs some work, right? And then if you can, you don't want to go borrow that money and pay, 12% on it, but, maybe it's something your parents help you with or a partner or somebody else, but like put that money into the building and raise the rents.
Yeah. Thank you, Jake. I appreciate that. Mike, to turn over to you, you've seen hundreds of transactions go through you and your team. Can you talk to me about like the biggest mistakes that you see newer investors make specifically with multifamily properties?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many random ones, and there's a lot of different ways, honestly, that we can answer this. I think one of the biggest ones, and I never want to discourage people from taking on more than they can handle, but I'll have a first time investor who wants or says that they want a very heavy value add property, and if you're doing a rehab loan and the numbers still work, that's great. But I've seen people that have never invested in real estate before. They don't even, know the difference between a regular outlet and a GFCI outlet. And they're taking on a property that needs, 75 to 100 grand a unit. And they don't realize how many things do go wrong in that process. I've got rehab properties and, seeing that it's everything that you listen to is true, especially the part of add a 10% to 10 to 20% buffer, because there's going to be so many things that go wrong. There's other mistakes that people can make. It's can be a little bit bold, but can be a little bit stressful to, overextend yourself. I don't want to hate on that too much, because I definitely did that early in my career. Didn't leave a whole lot in the bank for when, I was finally owning the property and, needed to account for work that needed to be done, things like that. I just was focused on growth. But, if you're buying a more turnkey property, and you're a newer investor, you're probably going to make less mistake than if you're a newer investor taking on something that's a lot heavier, just because, there is so much room for error when you're doing something like that. And that's something that, if it's your second investment, third investment, you've seen some things, or if you have a partner that knows what they're doing, those are much easier properties to handle, because you have a better sense of the actuality of how these numbers are going to play out. But there's not a whole lot of big mistakes that can be made if you're buying turnkey and you have a good broker, you have a good inspector, you have a good lender, and that whole team is working for you. So I would say the biggest mistake that we see is, people biting off more than they can chew as new investors.
Right. So a couple takeaways from that, guys. Like, number one, build a really good team around you, right? Like, have a good agent, lender, attorney in for our city, our state, a good inspector that could really point out things before you even buy the property. That's huge. That's key. And then the second thing is, I think, like, because I preach about it all the time, but I always have to preface this, especially like just on my YouTube and my client conversations with investors, that like the best thing you can do is like medium construction, value add, like find those properties that need work, fix it up, use a construction loan. But there's so many things that can go wrong, and that probably will go wrong. And like growing up, I did construction. My dad's a GC, and so like we did a lot of construction on a lot of 6-unit buildings, 3-unit, 4-unit buildings here in Chicago. And it's like I got to see firsthand, like I've had 15-hour days where on Bissell and Armitage, if you guys know where that is, we had to work on this 6-unit building and the inspector was coming. And so we literally like from like 7 a.m. to like almost midnight, we stayed there the whole day because we had a lot of issues with plumbing. And so like, just know that if you're looking to do those value adds and those construction projects, that's fine. That's great. But if you don't have a good team and this is your first time ever doing anything, like it's going to be very hard. Would you agree, Mike, with that?
Yeah. It's there's so much that goes into, understanding everything that can go wrong, that when you open up a wall to make a simple fix to the electric, you see all the problems with the way that the electric was done 40 years ago. And now you have to make more changes. And, with the plumbing, you open up the wall and all of a sudden you realize that, the gas lines aren't, as tight as they should be. And you have to go and check every, point at which the gas lines meet each other. Like, there's just little things that you don't even think about. You're like, well, why would that be the case? Well, because the work isn't always done up to standards in some of these buildings that are, already run down, because they're like icebergs. The more you see, on the surface, the more there's going to be underneath. If you know what you're doing, more so to anticipate and account for that. And that's why landlords that own property don't necessarily like when investors come in and lowball them. There are people that lowball for, just the sake of lowballing, but there's investors that lowball because they're like, I know there's plenty of stuff that's going to go wrong and I need to account for it up front.
Yeah. And if you're inexperienced, that's where an inspector comes into play. Like you really need a good inspector that can like find every single thing that could go wrong. But even then, you may not catch everything up front. Like no matter how much due diligence you do, until you open up the walls, sometimes like you get into the basement, like you just won't know, right? So like for you, Jake, a question I had was, we've covered a little bit of like the mistake piece, but what have you seen on the success side of things, like things that investors can do leading up to the purchase, during the purchase, and then maybe post? If you want to cover some high level 30,000-foot view on like key things that they could do to be successful in their house hacking or in their multifamily purchases.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it kind of comes back to the mistake points that Mike was pointing out too is, have an idea of your hourly rate, right? your time value of money, right? So if you're a consultant that bills $300 an hour, you really shouldn't be taking on a project that pulls you away from your main source of income, right? Unless you really want that hands-on experience and you want to get your hands dirty and put sweat equity into it. But I see a lot of people that don't fully understand when they start this journey, like they're very successful, whether young, middle, old, whatever age they are, it doesn't really matter, but they seem to want to focus on cash flow. They seem to want to be able to brag and get on a podcast, or they know Bigger Pockets. They know these type of places. They've heard these people talk about, overvaluing the cash flow of something. And then they get in this situation where they're stressed out. They bought in a lower class neighborhood where they maybe shouldn't have, right? They bought something that's a bigger fixer upper than they probably could handle. And yeah, they're going to get through it. But you look back and they're like, yeah, I spent 80 hours last month dealing with this property. I'm like, well, if you would have bought something that was $50,000 more expensive, you would have saved all that time, energy, and stress. And, this is not, your main gig right now. Like, you have a full-time job in those cases right now. If you're going to be a pure investor and you're going to be a developer or get into GC world, maybe totally different. But I challenge a lot of people to like have a number in mind, right? Like if you can't do it, if you can hire cheaper, hire somebody else, right? If you can buy something nicer that's going to, not distract you from your several $100,000 a year income, please do it, right? Like let's remember that this is about probably money at the end of the day, right? So that's a strategy. It's a very high level strategy, but it's something I bring up to people a lot.
Yeah, I think that's really good that people don't talk about often. In simpler terms, I'll break it down even like just to be as plain as possible. It's something as simple as like, even if you know how to fix like the stove in your house or replace, because like I replace glass, like I know that I can install a shower door, right? But would it really make sense for you to actually do that in exchange and take off work and give up 8 to 10 hours of that day or multiple days to install the shower door or fix your stove or whatever the case may be, right? And I know for us, like especially as guys, like we're proud like to fix something up yourself, install something. You look at it and you're like, yeah, like I did that, that was like I was able to do it. But really, if you're looking at the time value of money, and you could have spent that time just making more money, right? And I think that applies into what Jake was saying, right? So with that being said, Mike, I want to pass it on to you. In our market, and I think this is just in every city, we have a lot of low inventory issues, especially with multifamily properties being just really desirable. What would you recommend are some ways to deal with that, or at least like help win in a situation where there's just low inventory?
So, obviously having a good team is one of the biggest things, but there's a seasonality aspect here. And so that's something that I've personally always tried to take advantage of. So I have a decent portfolio. I've got 26 units, and I have bought in January or February almost exclusively.
Oh, seriously? Wow.
Yeah. So I've bought a couple here and there that have, been bought in, market timing of like, August. That was an off market one. I usually off market deals if the opportunity arises, but if I'm buying off the MLS, like a house hack, I'm living in a house hack at the moment. My last 2 house hacks were both put under contract in either late January or or early February, because in Chicago, we have a pretty dull period from about Christmas to about the Super Bowl. And in that period, there's just not a lot of buyers buying, and there's a lot of stale inventory that's on the market. And, so those properties that I bought, the valuations that I've seen in terms of like where they've gone to in a very short period of time have been massive. I've had people actually call me and offer me, money for my properties that was well over what I paid for them, 6 months after I bought it, because they just weren't looking in January and February. They're almost taking that time off. So that is something that you can definitely do. But, just as a general sense, if you're not buying, then just, honestly, the biggest thing is going to be price. And it's hard, but if you can project into the future that, hey, in 6 months to a year, I think I can refinance. It's not a huge deal if I pay an extra 10 or 20 grand on this property, because that's getting paid, on the back end of 30 years. And this is a long-term play for me. You got to keep in mind, what your goals are. If you're looking to hold for 2 years and then that's it, then, you can't do that. But if you're looking to buy and hold for basically forever, then 10 or 20 grand, whatever it is, to acquire a property is awesome. We talked about mistakes. The one mistake that I should have talked about then, and, I could just mention now, is people skipping over, a decent deal and not getting any deal, and then missing out on a decent deal. They're looking for a great deal, and so they skip over a decent deal, but the great deals don't necessarily exist, because if it is a great deal, people are going to bid it up until it's a decent deal. And what can be, a decent deal for you can turn into a great deal, with rent growth, with a potential, based on our current environment, with a potential refinance in, 6, 12, 24 months, something like that. There's going to be ebbs and flows in the market. Inevitably, historically, we've always seen it. You can look at a chart of where the interest rates have gone over the years. It may be longer than 24 months. It may be less. We don't know. We can try to predict, but there's going to be opportunities. It's just cyclical. So, those would be, the biggest things is don't be afraid to, pay up a little bit if it's something that you really think could work for you long term, and then try to play on the seasonality of it and buy when others aren't buying.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. One thing I would add too is like have your financing lined up. Like I know this is a typical marketing thing that a lot of lenders like to say, like get pre-approved, like don't miss out. Like, but I really think as an investor if you're especially in a market that's very competitive, if you don't have your financing lined up, like you could lose out on deals simply because you don't have like your lender ready to go. If you don't have like the capability of not only of course knowing your purchasing power, that's really important, but number two, like having a letter in hand saying that like, hey guys, like I'm ready to go. That's going to save you a lot of time, because some of these deals, like especially in the wintertime and for us, like when it's a dull market, you never know when these properties like go on the market. But it could be at any point. Like I bought my house and got a really good deal on it because I bought it 4th of July weekend. Like we saw, like I think July 3rd, it was like July 4th was a Sunday, I believe, something, or Monday. And my wife and I saw it like the day before. We weren't like going anywhere. And so it was dead. Like nobody was looking at this house. The seller knew it, the agent knew it. I saw it right away. I was like, babe, I was like, we're gonna lose this house. If we don't make an offer on it, like come next week, it's gonna go fast. And so we made an offer. I got seller credits, and I literally paid. I had a down payment grant that I leveraged and seller credits. I got $200 back at closing. Like it was the greatest thing ever, because of that reason. So like, yes, that was in the summer, but if you can, like in the dull periods where it's slow, that's where the biggest opportunities lie. Would you agree with that basically?
Yeah. No, if you can take advantage of the dull periods, and then, I think you're spot on with having your financing lined up. And I think what people, who are newer investors may not know is that, talking to a lender, first of all, is not a huge deal. They're, a lot of them are pretty low pressure. They're not going to, say, hey, I also need you to have something under contract in the next 2 weeks. No, you can, talk to a lender and then take your time. And if you're pretty confident that you're going to buy in the next 4 months, then go ahead, get pre-approved. Like, your hard credit pull, your pre-approval with a lot of lenders is going to last 120 days. And so, there's not this like finite, oh, I have to buy if I talk to a lender in the next 2 to 4 weeks. No, you've got a good period of time. And so if you're pretty confident that you're going to be buying, you should get pre-approved and you should be ready, because you might not like anything on the market right now. And then in 5 weeks, the perfect thing might pop on the market. And if you're scrambling to get all your docs in then, and other people think it's the perfect property for them as well, guess what? You're risking losing out, because a seller's not going to entertain an offer without a pre-approval. You need to have that in hand.
Yeah. I cannot tell you how many times people have texted me Friday night at 8 p.m., right? When like I'm out to dinner or I'm like with my wife, and then I'm like, I can't get to it by Saturday, like morning, afternoon, and even then, like I need a review, especially if you have a complicated situation. So, that is, and they'll lose out on deals because they're not ready. Or I've seen people get under contract and they're not even like approved, like actually approved, which I know in our market, like doesn't happen often. Maybe it's for the more creative deals, but like still, if you don't have to get like a hard pre-approval letter unless you're going to buy in the next 3 to 4 months. But even then, the pre-approval expires. All we need to do is just get a new credit report on file. So it's like, it's not the worst deal in the world. So I think, Mike, I totally agree. I think that's really important. Jake, for you, what are some main risk factors that a lot of investors have to be aware of, or some things to keep in mind when they're buying multifamily properties? Or like, how can they alleviate that risk?
Yeah, and it's a little bit of the strategy, topic as well. Is I see a lot of people this is single family home buyers, condo buyers, as well as they put themselves in this living situation where their timing is got to be almost perfect, right? My lease is up in June. I need to buy by, the beginning of June, or I'm selling a house. I need to buy into something very quickly. Like that's when you kind of back yourself into a corner a little bit, where you almost have no other option but to maybe close on something that you might not want to, or to kind of force yourself into like, hitting that perfect timing. So I think one of the biggest issues with young people is they start to look too late, right? Like my lease is up in August, and you're just reaching out to brokers in like June. Too late, right? Too late. If you can position yourself to be in like a month-to-month lease, or somehow be flexible, whether it's moving from home, living with a friend, whatever that is, that's one of the biggest issues I've seen is people come and they start looking a little too late, and we might end up buying something, but their motivation starts to become less about the building and the cash flow and the potential, and the motivation is I just need a place to live, right? So be careful. I think, again, back to what you can do, position yourself best, is start looking way in advance. Most brokers will set up a search for you. It takes 3 minutes for them to set up a search. Get a list of inventory coming to your inbox well in advance, so by the time you start looking, you kind of know what you're looking for. You can have a little bit of an idea of like, oh, I saw something close down the block for $600K, and this one looks very similar. It's listed for $550. What's going on? Like this could be a deal. If you're just starting to look at those comparisons, 2 weeks before you plan on making offers, it's a little too late. So that's one of the biggest issues I see, is like people put themselves in a situation where they're very time constrained. Another one to mention that's, people don't expect, and you can talk to this as a lender as well, as even the new conventional 5% down is a great thing, but a lot of people get surprised by how much cash you still have to have, right? You still need 6 months of reserves, right? So, another thing that's an issue for younger people that might have great income and a solid pre-approval, but if you don't have that cash and you can't just get it from mom and dad, right? Right before closing, right? So we see that a lot, right? And that was naturally the issue before with most people that are buying into something like this, is they don't have 10 to 20% down, right? Like it's not there. So save in advance.
Yeah. So plan ahead, guys, don't wait till the last minute. And then for the sake of time, you're going to force yourself to get into a bad deal. And then also know that for conventional financing, 5% down at the time of this recording, you do need 6 months reserves. And that could be, stocks, Roth IRA. It doesn't have to be like in a checking account per se, but you still need to show the lender that you have 6 months of the mortgage payment in a bank account. And I think it's good to have it anyway. Like, it's good for you as an investor to have that cushion, but especially for the lender, they won't give you the loan unless you have that. So 5% down plus closing costs plus the 6 months reserves. Keep that in mind. Thank you for bringing that up, Jake. I think that's really important. And also want to preface too, guys, when I say multifamily properties, when we're talking about that, we mean 2 to 4 units. So 5+ units is commercial, 2 to 4 units is still considered residential. That's where you get all the house hacking programs, the nice conventional FHA deals. So keep that in mind too. Mike, for you, what are the best value adds that you've seen, or like highest ROA strategies for people when they're fixing up their properties?
So it's going to be area specific. And so that's important to keep in mind. But I'm going to talk more so about Chicago and the Chicago neighborhoods. When you're trying to rent to young professionals, if you're, anywhere, Old Town, Avondale, Wicker Park, Lakeview, any of the areas where young professionals are trying to live, one of the biggest things is in-unit laundry. It's going to cost you
So simple.
$1,200 to $1,600 for the unit plus, whatever it costs from the plumber. I've gotten a couple quotes on that, but it's going to cost you a couple grand. Somebody might pay an extra $200-$300 a month for something like that, because if they like the unit already, because young professionals have disposable income. There is very much in the rental market the same kind of demand that you see in the housing market, in terms of if a young couple likes a place enough to where they would want to live there, they don't care if the rental comps are $3,000. They'll pay $3,200 a month just so that they can have it. Because the other place they looked at that was $3,000 didn't have in-unit laundry, and that's such an inconvenience to them. So stuff like that is, very, very crucial. Everybody's got different investing strategies. I personally buy very turnkey, high-end places. That has been my preference because of that aspect of disposable income. And so I would say, for me personally, if you're investing in A or high B class areas that are Chicago neighborhoods, instead of having a laminate countertop, go with a quartz or a granite countertop. Just the look of it is going to bring in so many more eyes and create demand. When I list my properties, I typically list them for rent at market, and I get anywhere between 20 and 25 applications because they show so well. Don't be afraid to freshly paint. Do the things that some landlords think are not value adds, but in my opinion are, if you're investing in those areas. Now, if you're investing in areas that are, pretty standard, if you're a pure investor that's investing, in, C, D class areas, and the restriction is just what's available and not, on the basis of disposable income, then that's why people rent rental grade. And that's why you hear stuff on podcasts of, this is what you should do. These are the main things that you should do. When we're talking Chicago and we're talking the Chicago neighborhoods, those things don't, really get talked about on podcasts, because the differentiator between this one place in Wicker and this other place in Wicker is a lot of times how much somebody likes it. And so there is, a very tangible aspect of upgrading your countertops, making sure that you have fixtures that are stylish. That stuff really carries weight with renters that have disposable income. So in my opinion, those are some of the biggest things that you can do. In-unit laundry, just functionally, for people that can, afford a place that they want, is going to be huge, just because it is such a hassle otherwise to walk down to the basement or walk to a laundromat. That is something that they do not want to do. And then just making it something that is aesthetically pleasing to a lot of people. It will create demand. It will create desire. And rental decisions are not just made on comps. Renters don't even really know the comp. They just know what else they're looking at, and they know they like this one better.
Yeah. And I'm seeing like multiple offer situations on like rentals. And I'm like,
yeah.
what?
Oh, yeah.
Like people are bidding in Chicago, and this may not be true in every market, but like in our market, we got people like, 3,000, 3,100, 3,200, like they're bidding for a freaking a 2-bed, 1-bath. Like it's crazy. Like I never thought that'd be, in purchase, sure, but in rental, and like that's the differentiating factor is the in-unit laundry. When my wife and I were buying our first condo a while back, we were like, we had our budget at the time, and we were willing to go above our budget to buy a condo that had, because believe it or not, there were a lot of them that didn't have like in-unit washer and dryer. And so we got lucky. We found this one, we bought it, and like we were like, yeah, I'll pay the extra $200 a month. I don't care. Like for the for the mortgage, because that's like a huge thing, right? Do you know, have you seen like value, like numbers wise, how much that increases the value or rent? I know it's relative, but like, isn't there a formula for like, if you add this value add or like a in-unit washer dryer, like you should be able to get X, Y, Z. Like, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's so hard because it all depends on what your base price is. I would say 100 to 200 a month can be had for a place that is, in a decent Chicago neighborhood, for a place that has in-unit laundry versus doesn't. It could even be more. I've got, some nicer units in Lakeview that I think if I had in-unit laundry, I could go maybe 300 above what I'm currently getting in terms of rent, because I've got, just a couple of units that don't have it. And I still get really good rent just because of the layout. So, but it depends, because if you're in Avondale where the base rent is 1,600, maybe it's 1,700 for in-unit laundry, and it depends on convenience. There's areas that have a lot more laundromats than others. So for me, it's tough to quantify. And, sometimes it's even unpredictable. You mentioned the multiple offer situations. I've got a unit in Bucktown. It's a 3-2 duplex. I looked at the comps, I knew what it was previously rented for. It's previously rented for $2,875. I looked at the comps. I was like, 3,000, maybe 3,100. So I listed for 3,000, and I had 22 applications from a single open house, got 3,400. And that was a mixture of just the unit being pretty and having in-unit laundry. And, so that is something that I, as a very experienced broker, I didn't even, have the ability to quantify, because it was just that so many people loved it more than what was currently on the market. So there is, an estimate, I would say 100 to 200, in most of the Chicago neighborhoods, if your rent is around 2,000 to 3,000. But it could be more, just depending on how much people like the unit in general, and it could be less depending on what your base rent is.
Yeah. And humans are irrational. Like we use emotions. It's not like I think the problem is people think that humans are way more logical than they actually are, especially when making decisions on where to live. And so like, yeah, if someone's willing to spend extra $400 to get that unit, like they'll do it because it's worth it. It could be the area, it could be the actual space inside, it could be everything. So I know we're getting top of the hour here, guys. So we're going to end with Jake. I'm going to ask you a question, and then we'll end with like just any last words you guys want to share. But Jake, can you shed some insight on like where you see the multifamily market evolving in the next few years? Like any predictions there?
Well, I think back to the inventory issue, right? Not a lot of cranes in the air when it comes to some of these outlier neighborhoods, outside of downtown. So we're hoping that the aldermen and people that are kind of in control of some of these policies expand on like the ADU allowance, right? So allowing for higher density in some of these 2, 3, 4 unit properties, or slightly larger properties. So we're seeing good progress there. The ADU pilot program, hasn't seen a lot of like permits or applications, but that's because it's been in kind of like some higher value neighborhoods, and it just still needs a little bit of tweaks to it. But I think that them recognizing it is a good first step, and I think it's going to get expanded. So hopefully, and I'm expecting some density to increase, right? Some of these garden units to be allowed as like legal living units, which again will increase kind of demand and hopefully, help kind of stabilize rents a little bit. So that I think is going to be something to watch. And, a lot of it depends on policy too, right? If we can get taxes under control, these are things that, will definitely help the market. But as far as multifamily, Chicago's still a very affordable place, right? Like, despite not major population growth overall, there is population growth in certain areas, right? So we continue to see rental demand, rent prices go up because of demand increasing. It's just a natural supply and demand, function. So we're very just bullish in general on rent continuing to go up. And because rent goes up, and these are investment properties, prices will go up, right? So like you said,
Yeah, and that's why
hopefully
Chicago is such a good market. Sorry to cut you off, but like just,
No, you're fine.
because it's not like LA or New York where, they're like 2x, 3x. People come here to Chicago from LA, like some of my clients from Cali, and they're like, wow, like this is so affordable. When a lot of people are, so like that's true. It is still relatively affordable. Yeah.
Yeah, and if we can address the density, I think that's going to be a big thing. There's talk of, on the development side of things, not requiring unit per parking space, as before. So if you build a 4-unit now, you need to have like 4 parking spaces unless you're really close to public transportation. If that changes, again, this is policy from top to bottom type of things that need to change. But I think that's kind of the only option. Like, where else can you really go? So that stuff getting recognized is helpful. So, I think blue skies ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Mike, any last words for like new investors, aspiring investors that maybe we haven't covered, or anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm going to steal from, David Green said this on a podcast once. So David Green, former host of Bigger Pockets, he's gone out on his own now. He said the biggest mistake, in his opinion, that he made, if he could do it all over again, his first 5 buildings, he would have gone as big as he could. Now, there's a caveat with that. And the caveat is to, if the numbers make sense, go more turnkey, especially if you're a newer investor. Jake and I, helped close a property for an investor of ours who was looking between, 600,000 and 800,000, not a bad budget. And she wasn't liking anything that she was seeing. And so I went out on a showing with her. I had a talk with her. I said, this is the property that I like that's currently on the market. It's 1.4 million. Now, if you can get approved for that and you have the down payment, still going 5% down, guess what? Your out of pocket per month is going to be equal to or less than the properties you're currently looking at. So to go up an extra 600,000 in price versus what you're currently looking, you're getting a gut rehabbed building. And, at an extra 600,000, when you're putting down 5%, you're only putting down an extra 30. So if you can get approved and you can have it, and you're in an area that is, what a lot of investors consider A class, the ability of your tenants to pay rent and the likelihood of your tenants to pay rent is even higher than in some of the areas where you're looking for $600,000 to $800,000 buildings that, are more run down. You're going to have less issues. You're more likely to have your tenants paying rent. And yes, upfront it seems scarier, but you're paying a very small, quote unquote small, because I know that everybody's at a different financial position, but from a 5% down perspective, you're paying a very small premium to upgrade everything about the property, the condition of the property, the time until you have to start worrying about CapEx items, the likelihood of your tenants paying rent, the comfortability and the ability to have people pay up on rent because they just like the unit. And then every single month, if your payment is equal, your out of pocket payment, is equal to or less, guess what? Your principal paid on your loan is significantly more. So you're creating more net worth that way. At an average inflationary, appreciation of 3%, now you're appreciating in an extra, 3% of 600,000 extra property,
Which is conservative, 3% for multifamily. But yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right. We've seen, like I've talked about, anywhere between, 4.5 and, almost 7% appreciation in Chicago the last couple of years. So, I'm just assuming inflation and hoping for more. But even at that, you're experiencing an extra, $18,000 per year of appreciation plus more principal pay down. So your net worth gains for the same exact out of pocket, if you can just have that extra, $30,000 of down payment, it's going to create so much more for you in terms of, ease of investment. Now, you want to make sure you have a safety net, because there's always a chance that, tenants can stop paying, things can go wrong, but it is less likely in that type of investment than, other types of investment. I'm going to knock on wood because this is what I've bought. So I do have some personal bias, but there is just so much more monthly net worth gains that you're getting. And maybe you're not buying a value add property where in the first year or two with some work, you're seeing 50,000 of sweat equity. But over the first 2 years, you might be seeing 60,000 of net worth gains just naturally, in addition to what you would have had in that other property. So I think that is an aspect of investing that is kind of ignored. To, in a sense, it's not talked about as much on podcasts because people talk about, higher cash on cash and immediately, and they talk about, value add. And there is certainly a time and a place for all of that. But especially as a new investor, I would, if you can afford it and you can get pre-approved for it, I would go bigger because it limits your risk and it creates more net worth gains.
100%. Yeah.
I'll add
love
one
that.
quick
Jake?
one quick thing.
Yeah.
Get a sewer scope.
Why?
Because 90% of the surprise big expense items for my clients that have come out of just like unexpected, at least, are sewer related. It's always plumbing, and it's because not all inspectors do sewer scopes. So a lot of times they're like, yeah, you can do it, but you have to find someone else. We have to meet them, and it's a pain in the butt. And honestly, most realtors, in fact, they're just don't recommend it because it's a high risk of the deal falling through, right? Like there's always something. No sewer is like perfect, but just please spend the extra $300 to get that done. It doesn't matter if it's a single family or a multifamily, but most of the multifamilies here are over or close to 100 years old, right? Clay pipes,
right. Galvanized pipes and all that. Yeah.
Just do it.
Yeah. Any other last words, Jake, from you?
No, I wanted to end on the dirty sewer scope thing, really. But again, I think, we're in this 2 to 4 unit environment. Like Mike said, leverage is huge, right? Especially when rates, especially the lower the rates are, right? Like if we had our ideal client all the time, it would be VA buyers putting 0% down, right? Because as soon as you hit a single dollar of cash flow with 0% down, your returns are technically like infinite, right? So the power of leverage is giant. So again, if the crowd is that house hacker crowd and a lot of the people, please just look into that and, be in a situation where, you can be comfortable with a little bit of loss, but look at what Mike mentioned, look at those principal pay down and focus on more of the internal numbers than necessarily of like, I'm losing, $60 a month or $100 a month. It's not, it's usually not worth it.
Got to look at the long-term gains, right? The appreciation, principal buy down, things of that nature. Any like for people that are listening, where can they go to learn more about you guys or like contact your team directly if they want to like buy or sell?
Info at the axongroup.com is our email, comes to just Mike and myself. So that's spelled out, the Axon Group, or our website, theaxongroup.com. Probably a couple of places to go.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that was valuable and I hope it was helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in. That wraps up our podcast. If you want to learn more about the Axon Group, Jake provided the information. You can look them up there. And then, of course, if you need any financing help, mortgage lending related to like house hacking, fixing and flipping, whatever the case may be, I'll put my link in the description as well. You guys can find me there. And of course, Jake and Mike, I'll put your info in that description so people can have it. Anyway, thank you guys again for joining me. Appreciate it.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.